Uh, Hello, everybody. It's me, Diego, back for day 3 of Grayhat. I want to thank everybody who's here, who's joining us today for our last day. If you want to see what we have scheduled, you can go to monerovillage.org, where we do have an updated schedule of everything that's going to be going on today. If I was on a little bit earlier, I could have read those to you, but I think you guys are capable of using a browser, so please do go check that out yourself. Once again, big thanks to Grayhat for hosting us. You could go visit their webpage at grayhat.co. There are other villages besides the Monero village with other content that may be of interest to you, so please go check them out. And they have a Discord group that you can join that we are a part of also. We're keeping an eye on those channels, and we can go ahead and respond or answer questions or just hang out if that's what you want to do. But we're already needing to go into our first talk. It's time to get started. So if you look at our schedule, we got a mining talk by Christy Lee Minahan. She is the mining girl with the mining plan, and she's going to be talking with us all about mining and kind of where we are in 2020 with that whole situation. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to pass that over to her. Christy, why don't you go ahead and take us away?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Diego. Pleasure to meet you all. Thank you for tuning in on this miserable day here in Seattle. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Give me 2 seconds. Does that work on your end, Diego?
It's not sharing, no.
Give me a second. Interesting. Jitsi does not seem to like, let me throw it up on another monitor. Voila, I
There we
can use
go.
technology. It is a miracle. All right. As mentioned, thank you so much for hosting me. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about mining today, give you guys kind of an update on what 2020 has done to the proof of work world and how that relates to RandomX, hardware in general, some of the trends we've been seeing. But befitting a privacy conference and a privacy coin, I also wanted to do a little deep dive in some of the analytics we're starting to get from the proof of work space and how that is starting to de anonymize a lot of miners. So, some food for thought to leave you with for the end of the day. All right, so let's get into the state of mining 2020. So, despite the rest of the world being on fire and us fighting a pandemic and the murder hornets, proof of work has been going pretty well for 2020. There were a bit of delays with hardware manufacturers, of course. The global coronavirus pandemic shut down manufacturing for almost 3 months, which set back a lot of the equipment. But in general, 2020 has been the year of mining. We have seen North American hash rate rise, which can be both good and bad. We've started to see more investment firms come into the mining space in a big way. Filecoin has completely taken off in the industry, especially in China. We're starting to see more and more miners continue to deploy capital into both Ethereum and Monero mining. We're starting to see dedicated firms just for running mining operations sprout up. It's also the year of renewables. We're seeing farms that specialize in natural gas and harnessing natural gas to mine cryptocurrency of all sorts. We're starting to see companies like Crusoe Energy and Upstream Data come into play. It's also the year for the public companies. We are seeing mining firms trying to go public, sometimes unsuccessfully in the case of Layer 1, and sometimes successfully in the case of, well, I guess eBang is the only company that's done it successfully this year. So it is quite an interesting industry right now. Um, Things that are of note is that we're also starting to see trends of larger companies coming into the mining space. Samsung has completely embraced blockchain and cryptocurrency as a whole and started to dedicate a big chunk of their wafer allocation to mining and mining customers. We're starting to see TSMC come out with support in a big way for their partners. BITMAIN is getting access to 5 nanometer wafers, which is a really big thing. Will 5 nanometer machines be useful? No. We're starting to see the rise of scam ASICs as well, with over 4 advertised random X ASICs out there. Pro tip, they don't work, they are all fake, and they're not even CPUs. They seem to be some Raspberry Pi configuration that's being shipped out from China to unsuspecting and foolish miners. We're seeing a lot of these scams starting to rise up in the mining space. Um, on hardware, we're also seeing a big trend now of Intel coming out with something called an ASIC, Acronix coming out with their own um, eFPGAs, and then Xilinx coming out with Flex ASICs. So this kind of hardware trend that we're starting to see in the altcoin world may eventually surface up into some of the bigger coins. Essentially, an eASIC, Flex ASIC, whatever you want to call it, it sits between a FPGA and an ASIC. It has so many reprogrammable options for the device or for the chip, and generally, you work with the manufacturer. So you work with Intel or Xilinx to get your IP cores loaded on there. You do hand optimize a portion of the back end, but you can still work with most of your traditional frameworks, most of your high-level languages and code. You're getting about 50% of the performance of a traditional ASIC if you were to compare it with all of the power savings and efficiencies of an FPGA. So right now we're seeing this adopted quite heavily in the Ravencoin Classic world. So the algorithm X16R coin has moved on to ProgPow. We're seeing this quite heavily in Handshake. We're seeing it being rolled out for many, many altcoins. RandomX is, of course, still quite safe in that regard. Um, with the push of Filecoin mining, a lot of investors are now starting to spec out ROIing on their CPUs using RandomX as a basis. So that was quite interesting for me to see. I've been a big proponent of the fact that algorithms really dictate some of the hardware investment, and that if you pick the right algorithm, the hardware will quickly follow. So we've started to see investors with Filecoin mining rigs, for example, spec out CPUs, have ROI factored in, and generally they're put to mining RandomX when they're not in use or carving off some of the capacity. Ethereum mining is still going strong. Have no idea why, quite frankly, because proof of stake is looming. And miners are continuing to deploy GPUs on that infrastructure. ASICs have started to steadily increase on the Ethereum network. What's really interesting to see is that InnoSilicon has come out with their latest ASIC that they call the ETHMaster A10 Pro. But it's actually some of their new memory PHY and GPU architecture sitting in the box. So it's not quite a traditional ASIC. InnoSilicon has recently made a very big push into the AI computing world. We're starting to see that come out of their hardware. And we'll get into the BITMAIN drama a little later and what it means for the future of mining. Or right here. So BITMAIN, as some of you may have heard, was kind of at war with each other early this year and even towards the middle of the year. So essentially, there has been infighting between the two founders of BITMAIN over A, which direction the company should go, and then eventually B, the employees and the revenues and control of the company. So for the first half of the year, this was all over social media. Some of you may have caught some of the interesting clips of fights breaking out within the BITMAIN offices and the company fighting with each other. What this has divulged into is sort of a split on the path of BITMAIN. So historically, BITMAIN had a whole AI house and AI operation, as well as a dedicated cryptocurrency arm. They're mostly well known for their crypto arm, but within China, they've started to grow a foothold in the HPC world. They've done really well on the AI side of their business, actually. With this growing tension, what has really happened is Jihan has decided BITMAIN will stay, really focused on their forte, which is crypto mining, building out ASICs to support some of these alternative coins, building out ASICs for Bitcoin, and trying to reclaim ownership of that sphere and of that space. And McCree has decided, well, I want to go take BITMAIN where the money is. So he's tried to carve out a bit of IP and try and really focus on the AI space. There's a lot of speculation about what this means, but the growing uncertainty and growing uh, unrest that's happening BITMAIN has caused a lot of shareholders to start thinking, okay, well, what do we do? And a lot of stakeholders in the Bitcoin mining system to start gravitating towards other machines. Now, what this means for the mining world is that right now, over 60 to 70% of ASICs are for Bitcoin mining, and almost 80% for altcoins are manufactured by BITMAIN or BITMAIN subsidiaries or their licensed BITMAIN technology. So if BITMAIN crumbles, there is a huge glut in the hardware market for mining. Leads to a lot of concerns about how secure does your proof of network become when you no longer have the hardware to secure the network. That being said, if we talk for a moment about some of the GPU and the CPU world, NVIDIA's recent acquisition of ARM has put growing concerns in the mining world about, okay, what does this mean for the future of ARM-based chips and mostly CPU-based algorithms? And AMD's acquisition of Xilinx has put a lot of concerns on the plate of, okay, what does that mean for the future of cheap AMD GPU hardware for mining specifically? Why that's a cause for concern? AMD is trying to go into the data center space, trying to really focus on going in that enterprise space, which means they most likely won't focus on their consumer market as much in 4 to 5 years. So these hardware trends are causing a lot of churn, and the time is ripe for a North American or basically any other entity to come into the ASIC space and really try and take claim of the hole that BITMAIN may leave if things keep going down this path. And so now what I wanted to get into, which is very befitting of a privacy conference. So as I talked about, right now there is uh, a lot of things that you can glean from data analysis, from anything being touched on before to transaction history, also being talked about, to nonces. Now, nonce detection was what helped Monero figure out the presence of ASICs before random X development really began and went underway. And nonce detection has also helped glean a lot of behavior of general machines. It helps researchers like me track machines that have not yet been released, and slowly over the course of a few years, researchers like myself have been able to build up techniques for helping to profile these machines just based off their nonce data. I want to get into a little bit about how that works, how we used this to help shed some light around the recent Ethereum Classic 51% attacks and some of the attacker psychology and behavior, and what that really means for the future of mining and for pools. So, what is a nonce? Well, if you're an Australian like me, a nonce means a worthless person. But if you are not an Australian and you're heavily in the mining world, it is a pseudo random number that gets utilized as a counter during mining. Um, and we have a beautiful little graphic here drawn by the artistry that is a PowerPoint illustrating, how this really works. So essentially, your nonce, it has to be below a certain target level. We call this the golden nonce, the winning nonce. So you can generate as many nonces as you want, and this is the process of mining, essentially generating nonces. And if it is above the target, if it is too large, then these are automatically rejected. But if it's below the target, that is your golden nonce. And it is a race to see who can, submit their winning solution to the network first. Now, normally, nonces should be entirely random, meaning that no nonce value should be any more likely to occur than the golden nonce. From 2010 to about 2016, all in the network was appropriately random. But in around May of 2016, we began to see this banding pattern that suddenly occurred. And it's interesting because that banding pattern coincided with the announcement of the S9 and 100 trillion USD on Twitter, Plan B. Some of you may know him from his controversial stock to flow model. First recognized this and published a quick analysis of it. And this banding pattern is really interesting because it almost corresponds with the hashboard layout of the S9s. Now, a little bit later, we started seeing the same sort of patterns appearing in the Monero blockchain, which I mentioned, first reported in January 7th of 2019. And then we started to see an analysis of this split by pool. And we started to see that most of the pools started to exhibit this pattern as well. So it wasn't necessarily a single miner behavior, and it was quite interesting. The industry hadn't quite figured out what this meant yet. And if we do a breakdown by pool, we see the same pattern is exhibiting on Antpool. It's on F2 pool. It's faintly on Bitfury. It's on BTC.com quite strongly, and it's sort of on Slushpool. And we wanted to make sure that this also wasn't being confused with overt ASIC boost. And so if we plot just the winning nonces for ASIC boost, we see that the pattern is still there, but it doesn't quite emerge early on in our block height, which shows that this banding isn't just due to the presence of ASIC boost. Now, why wasn't Bitfury's pools and Bitfury machines displaying this pattern? Well, that was because Bitfury did not have the capability to take advantage of most of the ASIC boosts, but it was also because the ASIC layout is completely different. There are other reasons which we will get into momentarily. So we had a theory, and we presented this theory last year, actually, at the end of 2019. Now, our theory was, what if you could use these weird patterns to start fingerprinting devices and gain some insights into the device and how it operates? So again, previously this had been built upon by other researchers around, Ravencoin, Monero, around Bitcoin. But what everyone had not been able to do was really quantify the data, and also B, assign some sort of value to how many devices were currently operating on a network. So in general, for a decentralized proof of work network, you want to ensure that you have as many machines distributed as possible. ASIC machines are generally hated in new and emerging proof of work coins simply because they cluster usually to one or two owners. And it's because of how the economics of ASICs work. You need one private investor to, usually upfront the capital, or you need one or two large clients to give you the capital to go build out these machines. So it's really just a fault of the ecosystem. Doesn't mean people are intentionally trying to be malicious. But what ends up happening is if you have one large participant on a network who is taking the largest slice of the pie, all of the other miners that are, either have been with the network or are just entering become really disenfranchised, and they just sort of move on to other coins. They're not interested in partaking in a network where one centralized entity really holds the bag. Traders also generally do not like trading on a coin that is inherently centralized, because it's very concerning that at any one point a whale can just dump the network. So, being able to fingerprint devices is really important, not only for the general ecosystem, but for a lot of the people that are trying to invest in this network and want to understand things like market share, and understand, how much power or weight entities like Bitmain really have. It's also very concerning that we can do this because, as I mentioned, inherently, mining should be random. It should be private. It should be anonymized sufficiently. Turns out that is not the case. So, with this theory in mind, we decided to try our first attempt on a blockchain that hadn't been done before, which was the Ethereum network. Now, at first, no obvious signal appears. So the winning nonce distribution appears pretty strongly, and you can see here in the blue squares that there are some dark spots that are visible, but these only represent a really small proportion of the mined blocks. So in general, it's kind of just noise. And that banding pattern specifically that we see towards the far right is actually indicative of NiceHash's stratum and how NiceHash fingerprints their nonces. So it wasn't too concerning for us. Over on the far left, the dark band that you see, this is actually representative of CPU mining. Essentially, how to interpret this graph is generally incrementing the nonce from 0, 1, 2, so on and so forth. Doing what we call a linear search strategy is entirely wasteful. But this was how all of the old school CPU mining code was written back in 2010, because quite frankly, parallel programming and more optimized search strategies hadn't really taken off back then. Eventually, mining software got more efficient, but most mining software is still forked from that original copy. So in the early stages of a coin, when there's no optimized miners, you still see quite a lot of the mining software using this linear search strategy. And so that shows up in the nonce pattern, where it's essentially just incrementing, and you get this clustering pattern. So without seeing any pattern, we kind of got disheartened, and then we thought, well, hang on, let's dive into this a little bit more. If we decide to analyze all 64 individual bits fixed within the nonce, we start to see some really interesting patterns, which can be due to either hardware, software, or pools. Specifically, we start seeing bit fixing happening at bit 40, and then eventually, bit 55, and then eventually bit 40. And what was interesting is that bit fixing at 55 was taking place almost a whole year before the announcement of the BITMAIN E3, and then it suddenly switched over. Now, this can be due to a few things. So number one, it's often due to testing firmware. So this specific bit fixing pattern can be a signature that's done for internal testing purposes to identify machines on a network. When ASIC manufacturers get into their testing stage, they have to test devices across a variety of pools to ensure that it's all compatible and that everything is working. And you get a lot of bugs solved during that issue. So helping to bit fix during this time frame can help identify the machines when they do an overall analysis, see general machine health. The other reason is that it can just be clustering that's happening because the machines are on the same network. We have seen that pattern emerge before. And the other reason is mostly just the manufacturers want to be able to fingerprint their machines even when it leaves their facility. So think about it from an ASIC manufacturer's point of view. When an ASIC manufacturer builds a bunch of machines, how do they know how to build the next batch? You don't want to oversaturate your coin market. You don't want to oversaturate it with hardware, because then your price of your original machines gets diluted, and miners will generally, amass, the price decreases. It's just generally not a good thing. So getting the right kind of supply for your network is incredibly important. And so by bit fixing, companies like BITMAIN and MicroBT and InnoSilicon are able to see whether or not their devices are still on the network. And if they can quantify that and assign some, some number to it, then they're able to also figure out how many machines are currently left operating based upon how many they've sold. They can cross-reference that with their warranty databases, etc. So really, really interesting behavior that hadn't been observed before. So then we thought, okay, let's dive into mining software, see if that exhibits some patterns. So Claymore, one of the most popular mining softwares for GPU-based cryptocurrencies, also shows this bit fixing behavior. And it changes based upon what version of the software has been released. So his signature shows up because the mining software picks a random value from the top 4 bytes, and then it linearly searches the bottom 4 bytes from 0. It infrequently changes the top 5 bytes, which is one of the efficiency gains you get when you're developing an ethash mining kernel. So we don't really need to change those top 5 bytes. We generally keep them fixed. Now, why would Claymore bitfix his software? Well, it helps him detect how many machines are currently using his software, and he can cross-reference that with his dev fees to essentially figure out, okay, am I getting paid the right amount of money? Then he's able to figure out, okay, have people circumvented my, my protection I had in place with my dev fees, and are people just, screwing me over? So he's able to get greater analytics on his customers, because obviously a miner is not going to tell you upfront if they're pirating your software and not paying you royalties or dev fees for your hard work. So very, very interesting behavior. And if you plot Claymore's bit fixing across all of his different releases, you see that the same pattern will continue to emerge. The specific bits he fixes changes. Usually it's a batch of 4, but it is still present. It has tapered off in 2019 and 2020, potentially because a bunch of us have been talking about how we can now detect these strategies. So then it was, with all of this research under our belt and with all of these tools, we wanted to apply this to one of the most controversial attacks that's been going on in the space, which is Ethereum Classic. So to catch folks up to speed, Ethereum Classic has been hit by 251% attacks plus a third one I have just learned. So they keep getting hit. And essentially it's causing a lot of interesting discussion in the proof of work community, because people are pointing fingers at NiceHash and saying, hey, stop renting out hash rate. You are the reason coins get 51% attacked. And then miners are pointing at Ethereum Classic and saying, no, it's because of your algorithm. You're a weaker version of Ethereum using ethash, change your algorithm. ASIC purists are saying just adopt ASICs and this won't happen, and so on and so forth. And so we wanted to take all of this research and see if we could apply it to the Ethereum Classic attacks and glean some more concrete information. So as mentioned, they had one on July 31st and one on August. Hash rate got rented from a rental service called NiceHash, or so the community speculated. And they inferred this only through, NiceHash order books, what was brought and sold, nothing more. So the cost to attack on July 31st was 192K roughly, with a profit of 5.6 million. And the cost to launch the second attack was 172K with a profit of 1.7 million. So the miner that performed this attack, left with quite a nice bag. So BitQuery helped provide all of the addresses that were mined to during the attack. So we were able to extract the attacker's specific blocks. Now, at first, we were hunting for that extra nonce used by NiceHash to try and pinpoint, NiceHash and try and go through the investigation that way. But what was interesting was all of the blocks from the attack, as well as nearby blocks up to 24 hours before the attack, had a, a similar value, and this was the extra data field. So extra data, for those of you who aren't familiar, is very similar to the Coinbase field in Bitcoin, but essentially it's not really used. Nodes in Ethereum and Ethereum Classic use it to store some random data. It has been used historically in Ethereum to vote for a mining algorithm change, but that has been really it. It's not really used. And what was weird is there was the same 64-bit pattern affixed in all of these blocks in this same extra data field. Weird. So once isolated, we were able to find a whole new set of addresses. And so you see here in red are the known attacker addresses from BitQuery. In cyan are all these addresses that were associated with the unique extra data field of the specific attack and the attacker. And you can see he had been on the network for quite some time. So he wasn't just coming out of nowhere. He was mining. And we were able to infer that he was experimenting on testnet a few months beforehand as well, and then jumping back to, the public chain and so on and so forth. So he had been there, he had been contributing. He may have also been mining over to Ethereum. So with both these address sets represented a really large amount of the hash rate during and after the attacks. Can see in this graph here kind of a breakdown. What's interesting is that the suspected attacker addresses, which use the same extra data content, had been consistent for ETC. And on average, they represented 2.5% of the network. So this was a Ethereum Classic participating miner. He was a member of the community that had been contributing, had been, ensuring that he was, a part. He liked Ethereum Classic for some reason. And one day he just decided, what if I perform? What if I rented a bunch of hash rate, performed this attack, and got away with it? And he did. And so he repeated it again. And you see right here in August 3rd and 4th, you can see that he almost drops all of his network hash rate offline. It's because he's panicking here at this moment. He's sort of taken all of his hash rate and just turned it off, redirected, sat on his earnings, and he's kind of like, well, shit, what did I just get away with? And then he comes back on with a tiny amount of his own hash rate. He's still testing and he's still preparing things on the private chain. So he's on testnet. So he's experimenting with his own hash rate. And then he launches another attack. And what is interesting is right at this point as well, on the second attack, this was when the Ethereum community had been monitoring their testnet services, and they saw that an attacker was preparing a 51% attack on the Ropsten network. They thought it was just, research and thought nothing of it. About 30 minutes later, the Ethereum Classic 51% attack comes out. And then, everyone in the community realized, oh shit, now we understand what's going on. And right here, what is also interesting is you see this massive amount of his hash rate in the suspected attacker. We see that it turns out he didn't just have 2.5% of the net hash sitting around. He did have some hash rate sitting on Ethereum that he's accidentally moved over. He's contaminated his addresses, and then he siphoned off a bunch of it, sent it back to Ethereum, and then he's continued to be a contributor. Now we were able to isolate these addresses as well to make sure that we had no contamination across different pools. So this was a private pool that the individual had set up. He was the only network participant. Not very good at covering his tracks, honestly. So then we wanted to go a little deeper and try and isolate, any kind of nice hash pattern, as well as see what else we could glean by looking at individual bit fixing. So at first, when we look at a weighted time average, patterns from the suspected attacker and known attacker blocks are not obvious. So we can't infer whether they're using GPUs, CPUs, ASICs. It's kind of just a blur. But with a little bit of magic, aka math, we do a block weighted average, and we clearly see this upper 6-bit that clusters together. Now, NiceHash has a upper 8-bit fixing pattern. It is not uncommon, however, for miners to put all of their rigs on NiceHash simply to get a bit of extra revenue or money in. And what's interesting to note is that this middle banding pattern has deferring bits from our previous ETH analysis, and it differs from the ETC average for the same period, meaning that whatever the software the miner was using was not the norm on the network. So he may have been using his own private miner or his own software that he had written, or just something that wasn't, popular around the ecosystem. Um, but as I mentioned before, it's quite common for miners to deploy everything to NiceHash just to wait for a bit of extra revenue. Um, and so if that was the case, we would see this stronger NiceHash pattern across the network. We would see stronger banding here because all miners would be using the same software. Turns out that's not the case. So this was quite interesting for us. And then the pattern in the nonce values for the first 51% attack on ETC is less distinct due to this smaller scope of attack, but we still see the banding of NiceHash here. And while the if we look at January 2019, and when Ethereum Classic had their 2019 51% attack, we start seeing that, yes, the extraData and miner addresses don't line up, but we still see these same patterns in the upper 6 bits. And middle banding is consistent with the exact same software. Now, this isn't enough data to infer, logically that these two attackers are the same. We don't believe they're the same. We believe it's completely unrelated. But it is interesting to note that whatever software they're using is exhibiting these same characteristics. So let's talk about what that means. extraData, nodes, shadow mining, and all of that jazz, and how that interferes with the privacy that mining promises. So a quick summary. Our suspected attacker addresses only go back all the way to blocks mined in 2017. Known attacker addresses were 2020. This means the attacker was a mining participant for almost 3 years. That narrows him down into two buckets: GPUs and Ethereum-based ASICs. The suspected attacker has all of this association with extraData in every single transaction or address that he's done, or addressers that were associated with the attacker. And suspected attacker had 2.5% of the net hash of ETC today. He's still an active miner even today in the network. Further research would be able to reveal what software and hardware he was using. And what is interesting is, I didn't touch on this, but we're actually able to quantify that. So we're able to figure out, based upon how many blocks have been won by that specific subset of addresses, what their average hash rate would be, and we can translate that into what percentage of the machines it would be. And then we can correlate that with manufacturers to figure out, is there, if he has, 100 ASICs worth of hash rate, work with an ASIC manufacturer to figure out, okay, did you guys sell, 100 ASICs worth of hash rate out there? So further concerns is that if you correlate this nonce analysis with exchange data of the attacker, timestamp data, and wallet analysis, his anonymity is drastically decreased. And if we did further analysis of both his blocks and the nodes which broadcasted the transactions, we'd be able to infer a sort of general location. Why? Well, if the attacker was smart, we probably wouldn't be able to get this information. But we can already see patterns of him panicking and freaking out as he's done this attack, and he generally wouldn't be that smart if he performs the exact same attack with the exact same pattern and fingerprint in there. And if we correlated this with exchange by sell flows from the suspected attacker, and we cross-reference this with utility bill schedules, we'd be able to get an even more accurate understanding of what a power grid the attacker is linked to. Now let me touch on that for a moment. Miner sell strategies. Miners in general will sell a percentage of their mining proceeds, their mining earnings, every month. Doesn't matter what network you're really on. This is because they have to pay for utility bills, and they have to pay for hosting. Now, a large percentage of the mining community across, both altcoins and Bitcoin does self-hosting. So generally there's just utilities. If you look historically, and you look at average bill payment dates for like power bills from certain utility grids. So here in, the US, we have something like TVA that serves electricity to a large mining farm. If we cross-reference when they usually ship out their bills to the sell data on some of the most common U.S. exchanges, you're able to actually figure out when miners are going to sell. And some of the traders use this strategy to, obviously take advantage of this. If we correlate this with the attacker, we're able to loosely pinpoint which utility he may or may not be linked to. Um, so quite interesting data. So where can we take this nonce analysis in the future from proof of work? Well, winning nonce values and bit fixing can actually give information about worker IDs, pool diagnostics, and hardware types. So we touched on a little bit through the talk on how that can be the case. Search strategies for the winning nonce differ, across hardware type, software type, but also coins. So if you look at the search strategies for, say, Monero, completely different for the search strategies of Ravencoin, completely different for the search strategies of Bitcoin. This is because the nonce search strategy, is really dependent on two things. It's dependent on the hardware physical layout of the chips and how they communicate together. And it's also dependent on the software and whether you're using a linear or a grouped search strategy for your winning nonces and for your mining. Um, Winning nonces can also be weighted to estimate a number of units. So you can bring further transparency to how many units are actually deployed. We do have a paper out there right now on quantifying this with all of the mathematics for those of you who are geeky minded. So feel free to hit me up for a copy of that, or just search E3 fingerprinting and it will come up. And by fingerprinting NiceHash's nonce signature, you can also accurately weigh the percent of rented hash on a chain at any one time. So bit fixing, as we inferred, is very beneficial to hardware manufacturers to keep an eye on number of units deployed. Nonce search strategies can be disguised, so this is something to point out, but they're often a side effect of hardware implementation or proxy. So if a mining developer who writes software really wants to disguise search strategies, that could be the case, but it feels like no one's really taken the effort to de-anonymize their search strategies. And it's because I don't think enough transparency is brought around to the patterns that emerge. Winning nonces can also be analyzed to look for new and emerging hardware types. So we've been able to infer, the new hardware types that are coming out on Vertcoin, on DGB, on some of the other smaller altcoins. They're mostly FPGA hybrids, but we're still able to see them because of the patterns they make. And fingerprinting this mining software gives really valuable insight into client breakdown. So, Claymore is able to cross-reference a lot of his own data with pools to figure out, okay, what distribution of clients do I have, running running on BTC.com, or running on F2 pool, which historically are clustered or centralized in China. And now I am going to take a very small break to leave it for questions. And I'm going to guess we don't have that capability, Diego.
We do have questions, if possible. I could just go ahead and
Yeah,
read them to you from the YouTube or the Discord, which I'm monitoring
that would
both.
be great.
So if you do have a question, please place it in any of the chats. I am monitoring both. I will read them out to Christy. If we can give this a minute or so, and if we don't have anything, we can go ahead and move on to the next portion.
What about you, Diego? Do you have questions?
Do I have questions? This was actually really interesting. The whole, I don't know. Obviously, this portion, a lot of this is extremely over my head, and I think it's something that may be over the head of a lot of different people. But like, I don't know. This kind of blows my mind that like you could just fingerprint these mining patterns, and in a way reduce the anonymity pool of like a potential attacker or something like that, and like, okay, so this guy or this, it's just another way that people can apply um, these heuristical techniques to fingerprint people. And on the mining scale, like when people are thinking, okay, how do we make coins more private, how do we hide the sender, how do we hide the receiver, who says how do we hide the mining patterns?
Exactly, exactly. And I feel like in the traditional privacy coin world, there's a lot of discussion, as you said, on, the actual coin itself, but there's a wealth of data just sitting in mining. Like it's so bad. And it's because at the end of the day, who gets to decide how you disguise these patterns? It's either the hardware developer, which they're incentivized to make sure this pattern stays in because it helps them get really granular client data.
Hmm.
That that's the benefit of blockchain. It's immutable. It's always going to be there. Really great for a manufacturer. Or it's the mining software developers. And quite frankly, since most of them live off dev fees, they're also incentivized to keep it in because they need to understand what percentage of hash rate deployed is currently running on their software. Um, so there's a huge gap right now in the ecosystem, and we've spent the last 6 to 7 months building out all of the tooling now to allow us to do this across multiple chains. So I'm really excited to start applying this to things like Monero and to Ravencoin and even some of the coins like Zcash and see what we can infer from that on a more granular level.
Yeah, that's absolutely nuts to me. It just goes to show how hard privacy is to actually get correct, because there are things you don't know that are even leaking your privacy, and how can you look at or fix or whatever what never even crosses your mind. So it does look like we do not have questions
That is
in the YouTube chat,
a-okay.
so we can go ahead and move on to the next portion.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you very much, Christy. Just yeah, blows my mind, as I said before. Things people don't even think about. But what has been? I guess just a quick question. What has been the most interesting thing for you this past year in regards to mining? Just like, is there any event or research that pops in your mind immediately that's like, this is just wow?
Yeah, so partly this, partly a lot of the politics that have come around the clean network and COVID-19.
Hmm.
So for those of you who aren't aware or who aren't in the US, the clean network is the Trump administration's initiative to try and keep Chinese technology out of America. And essentially, it's a whole alliance slash organization of different companies that are now auditing vendors that produce their hardware. So things like their networking chips and some of their CPU tech, etc. And also a lot of the 5G network providers. Now, this has led to a string of controversy around Chinese chip companies, namely Huawei, and has slowly been pushing them out of the ecosystem. What is interesting is that I'm starting to see some of the larger scale investors who had plans to come into mining in a very big way are starting to balk at the lack of hardware that's currently open source where they can audit it, or currently built by a manufacturer that is not centralized and sitting exclusively in China. So there's a lot of controversy that's happening behind the scenes in the hardware space. The other thing was COVID-19. So in March, when all of this was bubbling up, myself and my friends were all panicking, and anyone that was currently working for a hardware company was also freaking out because essentially everyone understood what this means. When China's manufacturing shuts down for 1 or 2 months, when factories shut down, it causes havoc in your supply chain. And so what this actually forced is a bunch of companies to start seeking alternative manufacturing and assembly in other places. And so you started to see the push of TSMC and their fab in Arizona. This was a combination of the clean network as well as COVID-19. You start to see companies like AMD and NVIDIA starting to push into the US for some assembly and into Taiwan for some manufacturing. Big push out of China just to try and meet all of the promised and delivered timelines. Um, COVID-19 has set the hardware world back by at least, a year and a half in terms of components and capacitors. So that 3 year quarantine drop, 3 month quarantine drop,
Sometimes it
that
feels like 3 years, huh?
yeah, I know, right? The 3 month quarantine drop of that China had to take for some of their areas, that is going to set us back quite heavily. And it's in the small things you don't think about. It's in the little capacitors and transistors, materials for the PCB. And so we're still going to have plenty of PCBs, but we're going to have no components to put on the damn boards. And this is why you're starting to see supply of hardware really like trickle out, where we're down at least 40% on Bitcoin mining hardware in terms of supply. We're down in GPU supply. Everyone knows the clusterfuck that has been the 3000 series launch of NVIDIA. We're down in supply on AMD side as well, down on the Xilinx side. So hardware companies are, kind of struggling. And anyone that was sitting in America before that time seems to be doing okay. That is both a good and bad thing. It means America didn't take quarantine seriously, but that is okay. So that was just really crazy to see, and how it affected, some of the mining farms and how they costed out their revenues for this year. How mining farms started thinking about how they're going to purchase hardware. How investors that wanted to come into the mining space started costing things out, and seeing how everyone sort of globally panicked back in February and March, knowing the impending shitstorm this was going to create. So yeah, the politics of all of this is very interesting to me. And I'm very concerned for what happens, when our sole supply of crypto mining hardware is based in one country. And it's based there because it's easy. That should be concerning to anyone.
Sure. What do you see? What do you see kind of for the future of mining? As first of all, COVID-19 is not done. It continues, and we're actually seeing spikes in different areas, um, uh, all over the world, really. So, kind of like moving into 2021, what do you see kind of happening with the mining scene? Are we going to see a continuation of current problems? Are we going to see further movement away from China? Like, what do you foresee in 2021?
So, interestingly, so things like Kazakhstan, Russia, Venezuela, they've all started to put policies in place for mining and are actually opening their doors to miners, saying, "Come build your infrastructure here. We will support you." So we're starting to see a lot of these Eastern European countries and Eastern countries support mining in a big way. With that will first come the infrastructure. So farms will start to deploy over there, slowly gravitate. And then hopefully in 3 to 4 years, we'll start to see hardware also follow. Now, I don't think China's ever going to lose their grip on on hash rate. I still think they're going to dominate on that to some degree. Um, but I will say that the large public companies in the US are paying attention to the cryptocurrency mining in a big way. So, your Xilinxes of the world, your Intels of the world, um, your NVIDIAs and your AMDs of the world, they're paying attention to blockchain. All of them have blockchain divisions. Usually they're focused on more supporting on the software side, but they are paying attention. And they've started to see that, it's an absolute mess when it comes to supply and demand. And it's an opportunity to just start building hardware and start shipping and deploying it in a very large way to miners. Um, and so I envision, eventually in probably 2 years, we're going to start seeing mining software bundled on some of these machines. Be able to mine RandomX out of the box with your latest Intel CPU, especially as more adoption of these currencies happens. Now with PayPal, sort of adopting and pushing from Bitcoin, that's going to cause big ripples in the ecosystem, because now there's actually a business case when JP Morgan is talking about Bitcoin, etc. There's a business case now for someone like Intel to go and manufacture dedicated Bitcoin ASICs and distribute that in the market at scale. And it's only a matter of time until that same sort of scale trickles down to the altcoin world. And so I think in, probably not 2021, but in 2022, it's going to be the war of, BITMAIN versus Intel, or BITMAIN versus AMD versus BITMAIN versus BITMAIN.
Mm. I mean, you've alluded to kind of the idea that Intel or AMD may start shipping kind of these protocols and these miners inside of the CPUs themselves. Is there any other coin besides Monero that kind of has this egalitarian CPU approach? Because Monero has RandomX, but a lot of these other ones are either GPU focused or
or they've or they've just like cloned RandomX.
Sure.
There is like a few altcoins, but they're really small market cap. The semi largest one is Veil that's coming out, also a privacy focused coin. Generally, the privacy coins seem to really want to go for the CPU based approach. There's a trend right now where people are trying to adopt a hybrid of CPU and GPU, where they allocate, a percentage of their blocks to CPU or percentage to GPU. Of course, that can be gamed. I think right now Monero still holds the crown for trying to make sure that everyone can participate in the network in a very fair way. So, they've been very committed to that cause. Very happy to see that RandomX hasn't been compromised as well. There have been people who've been trying to make dedicated FPGA bit streams just for RandomX, but they are struggling quite heavily, as they should, because emulating a CPU on an FPGA is quite a difficult thing. So very happy to see that. I think, Ethereum still wants to be GPU based, but I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding in the community about what that really means, because there's a difference between being based on GPU architecture or having, a piece of software that runs on GPUs or, targets GPUs. And in some of the dedicated ASIC world, the case can be made that ASICs have become quite accessible and egalitarian. Obviously, I can test that because there's a huge difference between the 40 million units of CPUs that are shipped out every month versus the 10,000 ASICs that are shipped out every month. Huge difference in that. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I know there's a lot of interest internally in these companies for Monero and for the fact that it targets CPUs. I mean, it's honestly a great client proposition as well. Your hardware can be making money while it's idle. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to support that?
Yeah. Okay, last question, because we are running out of time, but do you suspect, in your expert opinion, do you suspect that Monero's RandomX will accomplish what it's seeking out to accomplish, to remain egalitarian, not just for today, but for an extended period of time?
Yes. I think there's going to be dedicated ASICs, and I do air quotes for that because what an ASIC really means is it's just a specialized device. So I think we're going to see some really creative motherboards coming out that allow you to stack like 30 to 40 CPUs on one sort of plane. I've already seen some prototypes in China, but I think we're going to see some of those. It doesn't necessarily mean it disadvantages anyone else in the network. You can still go buy 30 or 40 CPUs and run them. It's just that this is more about saving space. So there's ways to gain efficiency that aren't directly correlated to hash rate. And that's all an ASIC miner really means. So I think we're going to see those eventually come out. But I think a Monero, something that is like that, is also going to be made really mainstream because it has natural applications in the rendering industry as well. A backplane for that would be amazing for CPU-based renderers. So I think it would make its way into the hands of a lot of people. I do not think you're going to see any major hash rate efficiency gains. Maybe at best a a 1% gain, but the cost is going to be absolutely redonkulous.
Hmm.
And yeah, at the end of the day, RandomX has achieved what it set out to do. It is it's an algorithm that targets and saturates every part of the CPU's architecture. So it has accomplished that, which
Cool
is
deal.
good.
RenMX may be the final push that we need to see multiple CPU motherboards, because, as you said, they do have other applications in other industries as well. So who knows? Okay, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Christy. Fascinating talk. Thank you for answering my questions and giving out this information. It's always great to have a mining expert on here. It's definitely something that people know exists in blockchain, but most people don't really understand how it works, or the politics behind it, as you say. Fascinating stories. Everyone, let's give Christy a great big virtual round of applause. I super appreciate you coming on here and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, man. Have a great one, guys. Cheers.
See ya. Okay, everybody, we are actually going to be moving right into. Oh no, my hair! It's all messed up. Stupid headphones. We're going to be moving right into our next talk because it is 10 o'clock right now, and so we got coming up for you now. Let's go ahead and put up the little slideshow so we can see the schedule for today. We got Namecoin. That's right. Okay, so you could go to monerovillage.org to see this schedule in a way that is not this kind of little slideshow that goes between this and that. If you want, but we're going to be moving directly into Namecoin. Jeremy Rand, who is a developer of Namecoin, he has kindly recorded 2 videos for us. One is the main presentation, and the second, it's kind of exciting. It's an addendum to the presentation, because there is literally some fantastic bleeding edge technology, as in within the past couple of days, that they've been working on, that he wants to share with us, because he is just so excited about that. So we're going to go ahead and switch on over to this Namecoin video that Jeremy Rand has provided for us. And there's going to be information if you have questions or you want to join or be a part of the community. There is going to be some information there for you about how to do that as well.
Hello, I'm Jeremy from Namecoin, and today I'll be talking about the plague that is certificate authorities, and how we've gone about making Namecoin provide possibly a usable alternative. So, if you're not familiar with Namecoin, you could think of it as DNS, but secured by a blockchain. We use the .bit top-level domain. The domain names are represented as special coins. You can think of them sort of like colored coins. We were the first project forked from Bitcoin way back in 2011. You could say we forked Bitcoin before it was cool. The original focus of the project was on censorship resistance, but later we got interested in using Namecoin as a public key infrastructure, with TLS as a major flagship example. So there are a couple of major centralization threats that certificate authorities pose. The first is that they can censor content by revoking certificates. There are a few recent examples of this. First, Sci-Hub's certificate was revoked by Komodo due to a copyright lawsuit. Second, the US Treasury Department hit a region of Ukraine with OFAC sanctions due to a geopolitical dispute, and as a result, Let's Encrypt revoked all of the certificates for people within that region of Ukraine. Third, OFAC sanctions were also placed on a small media outlet on the grounds that it's allegedly funded by a Russian guy, and it engaged in very highly nefarious things like posting divisive political content and even attempting to hold a political rally. The horror. Let's Encrypt revoked their certificate too. The other centralization threat is that CAs can enable interception of traffic, also called man-in-the-middle attacks. There are over 1,000 CAs that are trusted by browsers, and if any of them gets compromised, then man-in-the-middle attacks can happen. For example, DigiNotar was allegedly compromised by Iranian intelligence for the purpose of spying on Iranians. The adversary doesn't have to be an intelligence agency, though. WoSign handed out a certificate for GitHub.com to some random guy because he proved that he had an account on GitHub. CAs also regularly achieve too big to fail status. Startcom, in particular, decided to capitalize on the Heartbleed emergency by holding large parts of the internet for ransom, and they never had any consequences for this kind of misbehavior. Now, you might be noticing these two threats are inversely correlated. If you have too many CAs, then it's easier to find one who can get compromised, and so you're more vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. But if you don't have enough CAs, then it's hard to find one who will do business with you, and so you're more vulnerable to censorship. So the idea of trying to replace CAs with something that's maybe better isn't really a new thing. In particular, the DNS community realized quite a long time ago that if you had a secure version of the DNS, you could use that instead of certificate authorities. The way this works is basically the website owner puts a TLS certificate fingerprint in their DNS record, and the user's browser makes sure that the certificate matches that fingerprint by checking DNS. And this is actually standardized. There's an IETF spec for this. It's called DANE. And if we assume that the DNS is secure, for example, maybe via DNSSEC, then this should be secure. Now, we don't really trust the DNS, but maybe we do trust Namecoin to do what the DNS is supposed to do. So, can we adapt Dane to Namecoin? Well, it should be fairly straightforward, actually. Since Namecoin is interoperable with DNS, we can just follow the Dane specification and put TLS certificate fingerprints into Namecoin according to the spec. And we have a Namecoin to DNS bridge. It's a DNS server running on localhost. It supports DNSSEC, so it can sign the records with a DNSSEC key generated by the bridge. And the user would just configure Unbound to use the bridge's DNSSEC key for the .bit DNS zone. This should be pretty simple, right? Nope. Because browsers have rejected Dane. None of the major web browsers support it. Chromium and Firefox did briefly experiment with a modified version of Dane that stapled the DNS records into the TLS handshake instead of looking them up via DNS. This particular design doesn't work at all for Namecoin, and it also can't even prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. And then Chromium and Firefox both ended up rejecting even that. So, these are the high-level design goals that we had for making Namecoin usable for TLS. First off, we wanted to support what we call positive overrides, which basically means that a certificate that matches the Namecoin blockchain must be accepted, so this prevents censorship. We also wanted to support what we call negative overrides, which means the inverse. A certificate that doesn't match the Namecoin blockchain must be rejected. And we want it to work with standard unpatched TLS implementations, because there are only two kinds of people who fork Firefox, the Tor developers and insane people, and we are neither, so we're not going to fork Firefox. We want a very low attack surface. In particular, we want to minimize the amount of TLS logic that we're re-implementing, and we want this to be sandbox friendly. We also want to be aware that this is on a blockchain. Blockchains do not scale well, and so we don't want to make this any worse than it has to be. So we want to keep the amount of on-chain data extremely small. And for what it's worth, we are not dead set on supporting the entire Dane specification. If we have to restrict to, for example, certificate forms in order to achieve these other goals, that's okay. Supporting a subset of Dane is perfectly fine for us. So here are some examples of prior work that we don't really think are good solutions. First off, you could run your own friendly man-in-the-middle proxy, which intercepts TLS connections and then validates the certificates however you might like. Unfortunately, this re-implements the entire TLS protocol, and it also tends to break client certificates and certificate pinning. So this is way too much attack surface. I think we all remember Lenovo's Superfish. That happened because they decided to use an intercepting proxy, and they did it wrong. You could also hook the library functions for certificate verification via things like LD preload. This doesn't re-implement all of TLS, but it does still have to re-implement the entire certificate verifier. Also, these APIs use unstable C structures, which means if you upgrade a library, you might start corrupting memory. This is an improvement, but it's still way too much attack surface for us to be comfortable with it. A question we often get asked is, could a browser extension work for this? Sadly, no. Because all of the major browsers removed the relevant APIs quite a few years ago, and this was due to concerns about malware abusing those APIs. Also, even the old APIs would often leak things like login cookies. So this is not really a good option. And we've tried talking to the Chromium and Firefox developers about adding better APIs. They've actively refused to support our use case. So the TLS implementations that we focus don't really have anything
heard by everyone. I greatly apologize for this. Looking into it, trying to see what's going on.